The gravel crunched under my shoes as my own children guided me toward the car, their hands gentle, but their eyes already somewhere else. The house behind me, my house, stood in the early morning light like a photograph of a life I was suddenly no longer part of. I remember the cold air catching in my throat, the way my heart thudded as I realized I wasn't going home again. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because losing your place in the world can happen faster than you think. In that silence, I felt something in me collapse, a kind of grief that didn't make a sound but spread through my bones. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything started to unravel. I remember the exact moment everything shifted. One minute I was standing in the kitchen of the home I had built with my own hands, and the next, I was being ushered toward the front door as if I were some fragile thing that needed to be taken away. My children spoke in soft, practiced tones, but underneath it all, I felt the truth settling into my bones. This wasn't help. This was a decision made without me, and I was expected to comply. I kept looking around the house in Raleigh, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a counter, the door frame I had painted myself. I felt like I was watching my life being packed up without anyone bothering to ask if I was ready to leave it behind. There was a strange quiet in me as I tried to understand how quickly love could be replaced with management, how easily a grown woman could become a problem to be solved. I told myself to stay calm, but inside I felt a crack open, something sharp and humiliating. My children avoided meeting my eyes, as if the weight of what they were doing might be too heavy if they actually saw me. And in that moment, I understood. They believed they knew what was best for me, and my voice no longer mattered. I didn't know it then. But that drive away from my home was only the beginning of the unraveling, one that would take me somewhere I never imagined. And that place was where everything truly began to fall apart. The car ride felt endless, even though I knew the facility wasn't far. None of us spoke. The kind of silence that settles in when everyone understands something terrible is happening, but no one is brave enough to name it. I kept my eyes on the window, watching Raleigh fade behind us, trying to memorize the last bits of the life I had not agreed to leave. My children sat stiffly beside me, offering tight smiles that never reached their eyes. It was clear they thought this was kindness, but all I felt was a slow, sinking dread. As the miles passed, the truth settled deeper. Decisions had been made long before this drive. Quiet phone calls I wasn't included in. Papers I had signed months earlier, handed to me when I was tired and grieving, framed as routine things every widow handled. I remembered the blur of those days, how I trusted without reading, how I assumed my children were simply helping me through the fog. I didn't know those signatures would eventually be used to move me out of my own home. When we pulled into the facility lot, the first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. No laughter, no conversation drifting through open windows, just the sterile hum of a place built for efficiency rather than comfort. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of disinfectant, sharp enough to make my eyes water. The walls were blank, the lighting too bright, and I felt myself shrinking as someone placed a folder of rules into my hands. Standing there, I realized my life was no longer mine to shape. I had been escorted into a new existence without consent, without understanding. And it was that first night, in that unfamiliar room, when the weight of it all finally cracked something open inside me. The moment I stepped into that room, I felt something inside me go quiet. The walls were a flat, uninviting beige, the kind that absorbs every bit of warmth. A single bed, a dresser, a window that didn't open. Everything looked clean, but not lived in, not meant for a life with history. It felt like a place where people were kept, not where they belonged. I placed my small bag on the bed and listened to the unnatural stillness around me. No footsteps, no laughter, no familiar hum of my old house, just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. I sat down, trying to steady myself, but the loneliness hit in a wave so sharp it stole my breath. When the tears came, they came fast. I pressed my face into the pillow to muffle the sound, swallowing sobs like they were something shameful. I kept thinking about how I had always been easy to love, easy to rely on, easy to lean on. And yet, somehow, I had become someone they could set aside, someone whose comfort no longer mattered. The crying wasn't just about the room. It was the realization that I had been quietly edged out of my own life, and no one had noticed how deeply it cut. But somewhere in that collapse, I felt a small, stubborn spark stir, something that whispered that this wasn't the end of me. I didn't know it yet, but soon, new faces would walk into my life and change everything. I came into that place expecting nothing but silence and the slow fading of everything I had built my life around. I thought the days would blur together, one quiet hour folding into the next, with no real reason to lift my head. But it didn't stay that way for long. Before I even realized it, 3 women began weaving themselves into the empty spaces inside me. June was the first. I noticed her calm presence before I ever knew her name. She carried herself with a steadiness that made me feel like I could breathe a little deeper just by sitting near her. There was a kindness in her eyes that didn't demand anything from me, and in those early days, that alone felt like a gift. Lois was different, sharp, funny, unfiltered in a way that startled me at first. She had this habit of observing the smallest details and turning them into something lighthearted, something that made the heaviness in my chest ease for a moment. I didn't know how much I needed laughter until she nudged it back into my life. Then there was Carla, grounded, perceptive, quiet in her strength. She carried stories in the lines of her face, and even without speaking them aloud, I felt them. Being near her reminded me that endurance could be gentle, and resilience didn't always roar. The 3 of them, each so different, created a warmth I hadn't expected to feel again, little by little. Their companionship thawed something inside me, loosening the numbness I had been wrapped in since the day I arrived. And I didn't know it yet. But that tiny sense of belonging they offered would become the doorway to a truth I never saw coming, one that would change everything. I was only trying to tidy the small dresser they had given me. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the walls seemed to breathe their own kind of emptiness. I pulled open the bottom drawer, expecting nothing more than loose papers and the little scraps of life I had managed to bring with me. Instead, my fingers brushed against something familiar, soft, worn, and out of place. A leather folder I had not seen in months. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling a slow, uneasy pulse rise in my chest. When I finally opened it, my hands trembled so sharply I had to steady the edges against my knees. Inside was the deed to my home. The original deed, with my name etched in the places that mattered. Not theirs. Mine. A wave of disbelief washed over me, followed by something heavier, hotter, harder to swallow. I felt my heart twist as I realized this was never about protecting me or keeping me safe. They had already taken control of my life, but they had planned to take the house too. Every memory, every piece of the world I had built. They wanted it for themselves. That betrayal cut deeper than I knew anything could. It shook loose all the years I had spent telling myself I was easy to love, easy to care for, easy to set aside. But holding that deed, I felt something shift, a spark, small but alive, pushing back against the darkness I had let settle over me. For the first time since arriving here, I felt a current of resolve move through me. This wasn't the end. Not if that deed was still mine. And I knew exactly who I needed to talk to next. When the shock of the deed finally settled into something I could hold, I knew I couldn't carry it alone. I went straight to Carla, my hands still unsteady as I placed the folder in front of her. I watched her face while she read, searching for something solid to anchor myself to. When she finally looked up, there was a steadiness in her eyes that I hadn't felt in myself for a long time. She told me, in her calm, measured way, that the house was still legally mine. Every line, every signature, every clause pointed back to me. My rights had not disappeared just because someone hoped I wouldn't notice them. That truth hit me harder than the betrayal itself. It was as if a door cracked open in a room I thought had no exits. June was the first to react with a fierce kind of joy, urging me not to let anyone take what belonged to me. Lois, always observing, began listing quiet possibilities, the small steps that could help me move without drawing attention. And Carla stayed beside me, pointing out exactly what power I still held. As I listened to them, the fear that had lived inside my chest for weeks began to loosen. Confusion shifted into clarity, and clarity into a cautious kind of strength. I could feel something rebuilding itself inside me, piece by piece. By the time I closed the folder, I knew this was my turning point. I was done being carried by other people's choices. It was time to start planning my own. The moment I understood the house was still mine, I also understood I could not stay in that facility another day. The walls that once felt numb now felt suffocating, and every routine they tried to fold me into only sharpened my resolve. I needed a way out, and I needed it quietly. The four of us formed an unspoken pact, the kind sealed not by words, but by shared desperation. Carla began making discreet legal calls during hours when staff changed shifts, using her calm authority to navigate every document and requirement. June threw herself into creating distractions, drawing attention with her loud stories so no one noticed when I slipped away to check schedules or gather what little I owned. Lois became our strategist, finding loopholes in the facility rules and teaching me how to send the right emails without leaving a trail. Every step felt like moving through shadows, careful, deliberate, measured. My heart raced more than once when a staff member lingered too long or asked too many questions. But each time, the three of them pulled me back into focus. What surprised me most was how alive I felt, even in the fear. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was choosing. I was building my own freedom piece by piece. Late at night, when the halls settled into their predictable quiet, we finalized the timing and the route. Everything depended on one night, one opening, one chance. And as that night approached, I felt the weight of my old life shifting, ready to follow me out the door. The night we chose felt impossibly still, as if the whole building sensed something shifting beneath its routines. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, my small bag at my feet, listening to the familiar buzz of the hallway lights. When the clock finally reached the window of time we had studied for weeks, I stood up with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Carla was already in position, pretending to review paperwork near the front office so she could quietly unlock the timing of our exit. June created a burst of noise down the opposite corridor, drawing staff toward her like she had rehearsed it her whole life. Lois slipped ahead of me, checking corners with a calmness that steadied my nerves. I followed her through the dim hallway, every step feeling like it might give me away. But nothing happened. No alarms, no voices, no questioning eyes. When we pushed through the side door into the cold night air, my breath caught, not from fear, but from the shock of being outside without permission. A car waited for us, its engine low, its presence almost unreal. The ride to the airport blurred past in a rush of streetlights and adrenaline. But the moment that lives inside me forever is stepping onto that plane. The hush of the cabin, the soft overhead lights, the feeling of leaving everything behind. As I sank into my seat and the plane lifted from the runway, something inside me rose with it. For the first time in a long while, I felt my life beginning again. Traveling with those women felt like stepping into a version of myself I had forgotten. Every new place, every shoreline, every market, every quiet morning in a borrowed kitchen seemed to return a piece of me I thought had been taken forever. I could feel my shoulders loosen, my breath deepen, my mind stretch into spaces that had been shut for years. But healing has a way of brushing against old wounds, and it happened the morning I opened my suitcase and found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from my husband. Letters he had written in his final years, but never given me. As I read them, my hands trembled. He had worried about our children. Worried that fear and entitlement would twist their choices. He had begged me, in his gentle way, to protect myself if anything ever happened to him. His words cracked something open in me, not just grief, but a sharp clarity about how long these patterns had been forming. I was still sitting on the edge of the bed, those letters scattered around me like fallen leaves, when my phone rang. I saw my granddaughter's name and felt a sudden ache. Her voice, when I answered, was soft and unsteady, filled with a pain that didn't sound practiced or strategic. She missed me. She was confused. She was scared of what she'd been told. Her sincerity shook me in a place I thought was closed for good, leaving me caught between the bruises of the past and a fragile new possibility waiting to be understood. There came a morning when I realized silence was its own kind of prison. All the travel, all the laughter with the women who had helped me escape, all the letters from my husband, and the trembling voice of my granddaughter pressing through the phone. It all pointed to one truth. If I didn't speak, someone else might lose their home, their dignity, their sense of self the way I almost lost mine. I felt a steadiness rise in me, not loud but certain. I knew I had to tell the truth. Reaching out to a journalist felt like stepping into cold water, shocking and necessary. When we met, I heard my own voice describing the slow erosion of my independence, the signatures I barely remembered, the day my children led me out of my own house. I felt exposed, almost brittle. But the more I spoke, the more something inside me settled. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking clarity, protection, a way to turn my pain into warning and light. When the story finally went live, I braced myself for silence. Instead, the world seemed to exhale around me. Messages poured in from strangers who had faced similar betrayals, people thanking me for saying out loud what they never could. The response was overwhelming, humbling, frightening, and strangely healing. And just as the noise began to swell, another message arrived, one that would shift everything again and pull me back into the heart of my family in ways I never expected. Arriving in Savannah felt like stepping into a dream I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The air was warm, the streets slow and quiet, yet my heart beat fast enough to make the world tilt. I had imagined this moment so many times, but standing there with my bag in hand, I felt a tremor of fear run through me. I wasn't just meeting my granddaughter, I was meeting the part of my life I had lost and feared might never return. I saw her before she saw me, smaller than I remembered, older in ways a child shouldn't have to be. Her shoulders folded inward, as if she carried the weight of all the things she had believed, all the things she now questioned. When she finally looked up and realized it was me, the sorrow in her eyes was almost too much to bear. She moved toward me with a hesitance that broke something open in my chest. Her remorse came through not in words, but in the way she clung to uncertainty, in the way her breath shook as she tried to steady herself. I felt her longing, her confusion, her guilt pressing up against my own hurt. And in that moment, I understood that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a slow, deliberate choosing. I held her, not to wipe away the past, but to mark the start of something honest. As we sat together on a quiet bench, I knew healing was possible, but only if we walked toward it with truth, patience, and the courage to build something new. Leaving Savannah, I felt something in me settle and rise at the same time. That quiet moment with my granddaughter showed me what truly mattered. Not the house, not the betrayals, not the years I lost, but the truth that none of us heals alone. And as I sat with that clarity, another realization pressed forward. What happened to me was not rare. It was happening everywhere, to people who had no voice, no support, no one to tell them they still mattered. The thought stayed with me like a steady thrum. I had survived something that could have broken me entirely, and instead it opened my eyes. I began to see a pattern. Stories I had overheard in waiting rooms, whispers exchanged between residents, articles buried in small-town papers, seniors pushed aside, assets manipulated, autonomy stripped away under the guise of care. I knew then that my pain had a purpose. I started slowly, letting curiosity lead me. I researched protections for seniors, read about guardianship abuse, reached out to advocates who had dedicated their lives to fighting for dignity. Carla helped me interpret the legal frameworks. Lois gathered resources with her quiet determination. June pushed me to dream bigger than simple survival. We spent long evenings sketching ideas, imagining a place where people like us could find guidance before they reached the breaking point. With every conversation, every article, every plan scribbled on a notepad, something took shape, a mission not just to reclaim my own life, but to safeguard others. By the time we finalized our first blueprint, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had known. And that purpose would soon become real, in the form of the first haven. When I stepped into the haven for the first time, I felt my knees weaken in a way I hadn't expected. The rooms were quiet. sunlight falling across soft chairs and warm colors we chose with such care. It looked nothing like the place where I had once felt trapped. It looked like the life I had needed all along, steady, safe, dignified. I stood there for a long moment, letting the truth wash over me. This had grown from the very pain that almost ended me. As I walked through each space, I thought about what it meant for someone to arrive here after losing everything familiar. I wanted them to feel the opposite of abandonment the moment they crossed the threshold. And when the first seniors came in, tentative, exhausted, carrying stories I recognized in their eyes, I felt something inside me crack open. Not from hurt this time, but from a fierce, quiet pride. They were stepping into a beginning, not an ending. June brushed past me with her bold energy, rearranging pillows as if preparing royalty. Lois checked supplies with her steady precision. Carla stood beside me, taking in the scene with that calm certainty that had guided me through every legal storm. We had built this together, brick by brick, moment by moment, belief by belief. Watching those first residents settle in, I understood something with absolute clarity. This haven was not the destination. It was the first marker on a road I had never imagined walking, and it was only the beginning of what needed to come next. I sometimes stand in the quiet hallway of the haven before anyone else is awake, letting the stillness settle around me. In those moments, I can almost feel the echo of the woman I used to be, the one who believed her story had already ended, who thought losing her home meant losing herself. I remember the darkness of those early days, the helplessness, the betrayal that hollowed me out. But I also remember the hands that reached for me, the friends who reminded me that dignity is not something others grant. It is something we reclaim. Looking back now, I see that every breaking point was also a turning point. The night I cried into a thin pillow, the day I held the deed with trembling hands, the moment I chose to run, the voice of my granddaughter calling me back into family, and the fire that pushed me to build something larger than my own survival. Each step carried me toward a life I never imagined, a life built on truth, courage, and a refusal to disappear quietly. I owe so much to the women who walked beside me, to the advocates who believed in this mission, and to every person who has ever felt silenced but still whispered a yes to themselves. And now, I turn to you. If you have ever felt overlooked, pressured, or dismissed, I hope my story reminds you that your life is still your own. Your choices still matter. Your voice is still yours to use. If this meant something to you, share it. Speak about it, and help someone else remember their worth